On my right here, we have Will Rogers, who is the Global Coordinator for Beneficiary Communications at the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent.
Good morning.
Then to his right, we have Ms. Guiap San, who is the Director of Corporate Programs at the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. To her right, we have Lou August, who is the co-leader for Information and Communication Technology Development at World Vision.
Morning.
And to his right, we have Dr. Mirai Jun, who is a Dean and Professor at Keio University.
Good morning.
So I'm going to start off with a question to Guiap. With your experience on the ground, what is that key piece of information that people are really looking for in the aftermath of a disaster?
The kind of information that people are looking for is where can I get help? What kind of help can I get? And where can I go to find my family members? And how do I ensure that they get sufficient and timely services or help? And this is the kind of information that people are looking for in the immediately after the crisis.
And how is that information communicated or found most effectively?
The kind of information is communicated usually through the media, and I think that's the most effective way of actually getting information. Right now, there's an instant and a very efficient way of communicating. Government offices, of course, provide information, and local community leaders also have word-of-mouth kind of information that they can share. I think the challenge has been that it has been usually one-way communication, but not two-way communication. So there is information that is provided to the affected population, but there has not been information that has been collected timely from the affected population to really understand the kind of information that they are seeking.
Very interesting. So Will, do you feel that social media can change or affect that norm at all? Or?
I think that I totally agree 100% with what's been said here. The thing is, I think one of the bits of information that communities need is how they can get information back and sort of highlight their needs. I suppose Facebook and social media, styles of information sort of work. I think we have to really look at the lowest common denominator, what people have access to, depending on where that disaster is or the country they're in. But I think that it has to be a mix. It has to be a mix of social media. There's face-to-face, the normal traditional sort of ways we communicate. Obviously, radio and SMS. The lowest, the cheapest phone available. People have access to SMS, and I think we have to sort of look at a whole range of technologies to make that happen.
So it sounds like easy access is a really critical issue.
It's definitely the key. I suppose we can't put out information. We can't ask people to respond or give us information so we're able to deliver our aid more effectively if they don't get access to it. And access is obviously a key point.
So you mentioned that the lowest common denominator can differ by region or country. I mean, Lou, how do you see that those trends playing out in different parts of the world?
Sure. World Vision has about 1,600 areas that it serves around the world, and typically they're in the most impoverished communities in the world. So what those communities have access to technology-wise really varies. We're definitely seeing an increase in the use of mobile technology, people who are using SMS text messaging, but still in a lot of communities that we operate in, they don't even have that. So a lot of key preparation really comes down to the discipline and the nuts and bolts of community connections that you establish ahead of time, workings with the media, local radio that you establish ahead of time. However, when a disaster strikes in an area that is more developed or a semi-urban area, absolutely social media and the technologies play a big role. And even in the marginal areas, SMS messaging plays a big role. So at World Vision, we're looking at a number of initiatives to allow us to absorb those new forms of data coming in that I think traditionally the NGO industry hasn't been as responsive to, and it's a key initiative for us.
So what makes it easier or harder to move that data around? How, in terms of communication, is there a particular best practice that people should be adopting, or is there something different that they should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think that key is preparedness plans. Of the 80 countries that we operate in, all in the developing world, all 80 of them have rigorous preparedness plans These are outreaches to local media, to government agencies. How do we work when disaster strikes? And there's all kinds of scenario development, from a smaller disaster to the largest disaster. And then doing simulations, practicing those types of things. As far as the use of technology, how do we learn to better understand the kinds of patterns that social media is bringing in, whether it's SMS messaging systems, whether it's other types of social media, and how do we have that impact our response plan? We have a new initiative that's looking at both community assessments. So because World Vision operates in the communities that we respond in already, we have teams that are able to respond and assess physically on site. We also match that up with the social media that comes in so that we can verify, hey, what's correct, what's not correct, and what do we need to respond to.
So it sounds like there's a mixture of both going on.
Absolutely.
In terms of, that's great. So Dr. Jun, and you've studied these trends for quite some time, and I saw you nodding when Lou was talking about preparedness. What are your thoughts on the trends that have really shown up in the last 2 years?
Yeah, actually all the discussions about what kind of information needed immediately after the disaster, and then it's like a safety net of the family and the company member, and also the how to get home, and those information is basically provided from the kind of from top-down manner, that how the transportation is alive and that kind of thing. But at the same time, especially from learning from the last year's experience, and that's really came from people. So it's really important that we do have a kind of a both way of a communication media. So can I show my slides? If I prepared some of the slides. Okay, this is basically talking about comparing the situation of the mobile phone and mobile devices with 1995, which the Kobe earthquake was there. And then, last year, of course, a mobile network didn't really exist on 95, but it's there almost 100%. And all those equipments was equipped with access of the internet, which is including the Twitter and the SNS and type of a thing. And one more thing is the GPS, which is the Japanese devices, every single of them are equipped with a GPS so that the location information can help. So then that was very helpful for the safety information. And the last three, the batteries was I think this is the most important thing. And the ground station is mandatory to have 3 hours of a battery life. And then any kind of lazy boys, if you tell them wash your hands every night, they don't. But they are charging batteries of the cell phone every night. Okay, so that was the situation. So the 3 hours alive for the communicating by very short messages on the internet this time. So this is a kind of a lesson we have learned for the preparation for the future. If we do have internet access, even for the short messages, and that's going to be help for any kind of information.
I want to ask you to kind of build on one point. You mentioned that location information in particular can be really, really helpful. Can you expand on that and elaborate a little more?
Yeah, the location information is really amazing. I mean, if we also the Google Maps type of thing. So kind of pointing the geolocation information, binding the information with the location is very much normal now. So many family find out the family members locating in there, and they even moving real time, so that they find out that that family member is alive because it's moving. And also when you want to find out what kind of resources you can access near you, and then that's also can be provided in various ways. And day by day they started to create new sites to provide that kind of information. That here's the food, here's the water around you, and then that kind of thing. So that was amazing environment established and prepared this time, not before this disaster.
It's really fascinating. So Will, I'm gonna put you on the spot.
Great.
A little bit.
Thank you.
You know, we've been mentioning there's both authoritative information that's extremely useful, as well as crowdsourced information. But with information doubling so quickly online these days, is that extra information really more helpful or harmful? I mean, is it noise that's distracting from authoritative communication? What do you think?
I think the reality is there's no stopping it. There's a lot of information coming, and realistically, I think, why would you want to stop it? You know, if that information is coming from communities or affected populations, and we want to, that's, I suppose, the bigger question is, how do we harness that information? How do we actually manage it? And what I think would be great to see would be some sort of system where we can capture the Google information, the Ushahidi information, all the different players that are out there, get it into a central location and grab all this noise. The more discussion going on, the better, I think. And the more feedback we're getting from communities, it's a really important thing. But gather all that information to a central space that we all have access to and look at trends. You know, what are the real needs? And I think they sort of, you know, people sort of got close to that in Haiti. But I suppose how that information gets to the traditional humanitarian sort of sector and how we're able to sort of look at it and go, okay, these are the big issues, 1, 2, 3, 4, let's focus on that stuff and let's move forward, you know, and focus and deliver on those things. So I think the biggest thing is you can't stop the information. You know, the information's going to keep on coming.
So more information is always better?
Well, I think it's the reality of what's happening. You know, we don't have a choice. There's no way of turning the switch off and saying, okay, well, just the government's talking on, you know, different countries differ, but the reality is it's all out there.
So, Guiyap, what are your thoughts? I mean, do you think it's important for governments to jump in and sort of dispel those rumors, or do you think it's better for there to be as much information out there as possible?
I don't think you can stop information from being collected from different places. There will always be more information. But I do think that there has to be quality of information and the consistency of information that needs to be collected at a central location, which can then be shared with in an open and transparent way. If, for instance, the affected person is looking for health center, and then the information that the person is accessing provides two conflicting information, and the person does not know where to go. So I think making sure that the information is consistent, coherent, in such a way that it is useful and it is actually providing qualitative information, I think is critical. And of course, the government plays a key role in that sense that the government should be able to actually share that critical open data in the beginning stage of crisis, but not just in the beginning stage of crisis, but throughout the whole period. And I just also want to add what Will said, which is that the consolidated central information hub is something that we are trying to develop from the UN system. And we recognize the importance of that. And actually having that data being shared by all humanitarian actors in such a way that there is a real-time information and instant information that can be made available to all people, not just the affected population, but also the actors who are responding to those needs in such a way that we can make effective decision-making process.
Yeah, I think the coordination of that information is a really important thing, for sure.
So, I mean, what's keeping us from getting to that future where we have a central place, for people to instantly communicate in real time? What are the challenges and barriers that are keeping us from getting there?
I think there are many. I think there are different kind of infrastructure web platforms that are available. It's not harmonized. And I also think that information comes from different sources.
Sure.
Of course, because there's so much information out there, we don't know which one is authoritative and real information. And I think technology, of course, as I mentioned earlier, plays a key role in such a way that I think in the future, it should be able to help or enable the humanitarian actors in particular to be able to actually use that as a way of communicating more effectively.
Interesting. So, Lou, ideally, how would that centralized database be curated? And who would curate that? Because, we do want, authoritative information to come through while getting quality crowdsourced information.
Sure. And maybe just a quick reflection on the previous question. I think that data is responded to as one has the ability to respond to it. It's not neither good nor bad natively. If an organization is prepared and is able to respond to it, then data is great. But I think it also depends on the type of disaster. I mean, a rapid onset disaster like an earthquake or a tsunami, there tends to be this huge wave of data coming into organizations. There's a particularly acute ability to absorb information. But if it's not a rapid onset disaster, things like famine and other areas like that, I think that data is rarely at a point where it overwhelms an organization. It's really good for tracking and early warning of an emergency taking place. As far as who should be managing this and all, I think that each of our organizations has a responsibility to go down this track. I mean, the SPHERE standards, which virtually every humanitarian organization adheres to, requires that we both provide information to communities and respond to information from communities. I think that the NGO sector and the great work of UN OCHA and FRC and others has already set great grounds for collaboration. And I think we need to continue that. I was made aware of a project just yesterday where we're going to be looking at identifying what is the structured data sets that we all need to be capturing. Let's work together to capture that information. Who's going to host the platforms for storing that? I don't think there's any pride of ownership in the NGO sector or in the UN government sector. We just want a solution that works. And so I think that just continued collaboration in that area, and also looking at new ways of processing information, crowdsourcing the verification of what's valid data. The social media does present a lot of information, some of which is not correct, but we can use the power of social media in the opposite side, pushing it out to the cloud, to crowdsourcing, to have other people verify it and push back what is the most pertinent.
I mean, so you mentioned that a rapid onset disaster, so an earthquake, might be different from one that has a long-term progression. And how data is used. And so I'm wondering, if you or Dr. Jun, if you could comment on how disaster needs change over a period of time for each of those different types of disasters.
Well, actually, that's a very interesting question. So the kind of destroying the communication infrastructure, type and how they would be, destroyed is changed by time, and the type of the disaster and everything. I mean, tsunami was amazing because that's a kind of clean up all the infrastructure instead of cut each of the cable one by one type of a thing. So the satellite, reaching the satellite was the only way. This is just an example. But getting back to the information on that, accessing the information on that thing, that situation, validation of the situation, and still the important thing is access of the data and the sharing of the data, and of course, reusable data, manipulatable data. That's basically the key issue of the data. And then I have a little bit of concern about the central database concept because a lot of data for this important thing is that, yes, the set of the data has to be prepared and then provided. But the question is that it doesn't have to be a central anymore, right? It can be a distributed manner. Remember, when the internet started, all the information and all the archives were staying in the kind of central position. Like, Berkeley archive, MIT archive, and that was internet. And then the web started, and the data would be distributed, but still accessible, right? So that you mentioned about the cloud, and then so we do have a lot of a sophisticated way of distributing the data, still providing the complete set of the data. So I think we really should prepare for the make sure that the people can access the data, even for the variety of ways of a disaster happened, and the destroying of the communication infrastructure. That's going to be a kind of diversity of ways, and then still providing the alternative paths to access the real data, and so that's kind of a distributed processing type of approaches to the data sharing. That's a really key issue.
So it sounds like the approach that we're talking about is the difference between accessible information and centralized information availability. So are you arguing that basically information, as long as it's accessible and basically crawlable and in a centralized database, that's enough? Whereas I think, Gui, you were saying it's more important to have information available in one central place.
No, I think it's not possible to have one set of information in central location.
Okay.
But I do think what I'm trying to say is that there has to be consistency of information and the quality of information that needs to be provided to the whole humanitarian community. And I think Open Data Initiative is something that that is being very much discussed and debated, not here in Japan, which I understand is being debated this week, but in many countries. And I think that as the beneficiaries of disaster, they will want to take ownership of their own fate and determine the kind of information they want to get. So instead of actually, I think in the previous presentation by Google, it was actually the information was provided to the responders for the responders to actually use the information to provide assistance. In the future, with the open data, with a lot of information that's available, I think the beneficiaries will find the information themselves to help themselves. And I think that's going to be a very different kind of way of communication and the way in which we work and respond from the humanitarian side. So I think it's not in central location that's important, but I think there has to be standards of information and sharing of the information in a coherent fashion in such a way that is useful for the people who are looking for information.
Sure.
I think just to add to that is the important thing is trying to get community-driven responses where it's not us just coming in and saying, okay, this is what we did last time, that'll work this time, because I think that fails. A lot of the, throughout history that's failed. I suppose there's a discussion about what information that we have to push out, but really what information do we need as responders from the community to sort of be more effective as opposed to sort of, this sort of top-down sort of thing. So setting up systems and centralising, I think whether it's centralised, whether it's distributed, however that works, but some sort of point where we're able to gather, because there's the humanitarian sector, there's the IT sector, there's the media sector, there's a whole lot of different players, the telcos,
sure.
Everybody's responding, and there's a lot of stuff going on, but trying to get that so we actually capture all the information, we're not missing out, we're not having these preconceived ideas that, surely this is what they want. They wanted it last time, so let's do it again this time. It's more about trying for us to sort of look at those trends, and I said before is, okay, this is an issue, and this is coming from the community as opposed to us just sort of jamming things down people's throats.
So really adjusting to local needs.
Yeah, absolutely. It's where it's got to go. The ownership has to come from the communities.
If I just may add just one thing about the data. I think collecting data, especially for preparedness, the data sets, such as they will actually provide information on baseline to be able to immediately assess needs. That kind of information has to have some kind of standards, and it should be actually centralized or should be facilitated by authoritative data information. But I think the type of information that a lot of times the beneficiaries are looking right after crisis, where can I get help and who can I get help from? And I mean, I think that's much more of a free flow kind of information. Interesting.
I think at World Vision, we're looking at sort of a combination of those. We've done an incredible amount of work with mapping and making data sets visible on maps. The example that you provided of the roads, we worked with Toyota to do something similar to know which roads were actually being open. So I think just like the internet, our disaster responders will get to learn who has the best data and apply that as layers in our maps, similar to what we're doing right now. So if IFRC is publishing a good data set, our responders will be able to put that up on a map and say, yeah, we're gonna overlay that and see what's going on, or if UNOCHA or others. And I think the key is open data. The key is making your data available. The key is APIs so that our systems can access that data. And it's really up to our emergency responders, just like when we use the internet ourselves. Who has the best data? And fine-tuning that to optimize our response.
Yeah. Let me share the experiences of what Suzuki-san talked about. And on that day, when the Minister of Education started to share the radiation activities from the accident of the nuclear plant, that happened, and then they were kind of struggling because it's not prepared, and then they were not sure whether they show the raw data or not. Type of a thing, and because we have a long history, back from the Hiroshima area, that how the radiation activity information should be shared or not, type of a discussion, and then but then as soon as it was on the web, and of course the web was kind of crashed because of the high number of the access. And that's number one. And the number two was the data itself was kind of tagged on the Japanese language, so that nobody can, except for the Japanese readers, cannot read. So it has to be optimized for the international global information. And the first version was a PDF, and then it has to be manipulated. It cannot be manipulated by the experts around my question to Suzuki-san was, can we help, adding the English tag and the manipulatable format and other things? And usually the answer is no, because this is the government authority information, and changed by the university, and then share. Okay, this is usually no. This is impossible unless it's prepared, right? Okay, so to which extent, the lesson from this story that, the Ministry of Education as an authoritative entity for providing the data, they have to prepare that which level of the information they should share, and then which format. And probably that's we can do next time, no confusion anymore. And then that was a super decision was done by the Vice Minister, Suzuki-san, because of his leadership that time, but not anymore. And probably we can set up the kind of a guideline to do that. And the second, a lot of help by on the internet to manipulate for the visualization, and then the utilization would be necessary. And then so probably remanipulatable, reusable data format is really essential. So this also can be prepared, and that's what we are working on for the future, the next time disaster agent.
Just a brief comment. The fact that data was published, World Vision has people in Japan that were able to access that data, and within hours we were advising our people where to go and not to go. Using mapping, we overlaid it with wind patterns, and we were actually predicting where the danger points were. That was absolutely incredible. So thanks for doing that. And I think we all need to get in the habit of doing that. Don't underestimate the power of the crowd, so to speak, the technologists and the NGOs, to be able to take that data and make use of the data. But it has to become available.
That's exactly the case, yeah.
And I would love to hear, are there governments and organizations that are doing this particularly well that you would kind of hold as a gold standard?
We have actually been looking at a number of countries. And the government of Kenya has taken a very interesting initiative on open data. And they are actually making the information much more publicly available, so that the people who are in need can access the information much more openly than they have done in the past.
Wow.
Now, I think the challenge of a lot of developing countries is that their documentary and the data storage system is not as well developed or advanced as a lot of other developed countries. But even the developed countries, I think the open data itself is something, is a subject discussion matter. And I don't think that we have actually come that far to be able to share information and make it available and for free, actually, to the public in such a way that information can be shared and actually can be a source for knowledge building platform.
Fascinating. So, Will, do you have anything to add? Or?
I think my sort of thoughts, something that keeps on coming into my head is that we have to think about this. There's a lot of information going out, and I think everybody's got some ability to pump information out about disasters or what's going on. The point is when we start sort of talking about two-way, we're sort of trying to open up the dialogue and get information from communities. We set up expectations, and there's an accountability thing. So if we're just pumping out information as authorities on a disaster, as soon as the beneficiaries or the communities are sort of getting that information, they think that, you know, there's an expectation sort of attached to that. And we have to be making sure that we're accountable. We're not just communicating or pumping out information for the sake of it and saying, we're doing our bit, here's all the information, see you later, and it's up to you guys to sort it out. There's some level where we have to turn information into action. You know, we have to act on this stuff. And as responders, we have that responsibility to do that. And I think the whole communication thing and the one and two way, the dialogue and all this stuff is about, there needs to be an end to it. There needs to be that point of, okay, we analyse that information, we engage with communities more, and then we deliver an outcome. And I think that's where we have to be really clear and making ourselves accountable, and as groups, you know, that we're grabbing that information, we're saying, okay, we know the issue is here, let's deal with that issue, as opposed to just sort of communicating.
So I would love to open it up to the audience. We're going to have 2 microphones coming around. If you have any questions for our panelists, please raise your hand and then we can bring the microphone over to you. Question? Oh, there's one in the middle.
日本人の天野と申します。やっぱ世界各国によって民族や宗教、文化、教育のレベル、こういったものが異なってくると思うんですが、その人々によって、重要な情報、これをやはりその情報を共有する場合にですね、分散化をして情報を発信する方法っていうのは、どのように考えられてますでしょうか。
You got the question? Okay. Yeah, the question is basically the diversity of the culture, religion, and the location and the policy. That's very different around the world, and then still the information should be shared in a distributed manner. So how can we achieve that? And meaning that some of the element of the religion and the country culture, they are kind of blocking the information and other things, but then so, okay.
Thanks.
You can come.
Thank you.
That's a fabulous question. Because World Vision operates in 80 countries around the world, we definitely encounter that. And we operate in these countries at the discretion of the governments. So we have to be careful about the way we operate, or we will not continue to operate in those countries. But at the same time, we have advocacy. So if there's an open data, for example, or open internet, availability of internet, I mean, we know these are all good things. And so we have people involved in advocacy who are always pushing that envelope in the right way so that we see progress. I think key to that is, for us, has been developing national plans that address all of the cultural differences, the political differences, the religious differences, even the indigenous differences between the people, and then coming up with operating plans for multiple types of disasters, modeling the way that we'll behave so that when that disaster does strike, we can optimize the outcome. And then between disasters, having that advocacy so that we can overcome some of the barriers that exist.
Oh, yeah, I have a question, along with that things. And we worked on last year about that kind of information from the Japanese government being Japanese languages, so that translating into English and the other local languages. I mean, Vietnamese and other things. But what is the UN point or the global point that if the information, we're going to create the information so the English, using the English as a priority, is that the way? I mean, is there any suggestion about the language?
Well, there are 5 official UN languages, so I don't think that actually we should prioritize one over the other. And I also think that the local indigenous language is far more effective way of communicating. But it is true that if the information has to be shared globally and widely, how do we ensure that there is an effective means of communication? I think it's something that we need to think about, but in response to the question that came up, I want to highlight 4 factors which I think are critical. One is the leadership of any kind of given institution or country that actually brings the governance, effective governance structure in place to share information. And the second one is a cultural dimension. I think the different people have different ways of sharing information. So for instance, in Indonesia, we know in the last disaster in March that actually the most effective means of communication was through Twitter. And Indonesia, I understand, has the biggest coverage of Twitter, which is not necessarily the most effective communication means, for instance, in Haiti. So I think that you need to actually be able to find out what is the most effective way of communicating in a given culture. And the third component is the investment. Just like all things, you can't just expect things to happen. You have to invest. That also means building the capacity. That also means making sure that the human resources, whether at the young teenage years or at the village community leadership level, has to be invested. And the final one is technology, making the technology widely used. I was actually thinking while I was preparing for this session, is that if you have a very good, effective technology innovation and making it available in the first outset of crisis, which people are not used to, then it's not very useful. People actually want to use technology that they are familiar with, something that they are used on a day-to-day basis. And the technology has to be very much part of their day-to-day lives. So again, that easy and very kind of facilitative technology is important. And I hope that, I think that as this event demonstrates, there's a lot more greater emphasis on technology innovation, which actually obviously is key to information sharing and development.
Any other questions in the back? There's 2 in the back.
Thank you. Thank you very much for interesting exchanges of opinions. My name is Sugai from Japanese Red Cross. My question is regarding the consistency of information and data management. Of course, the easier access to the information is better, but I may see some risks for consistency of the data. I heard 140,000 records are in Person Finder, but who are the volunteers putting the data in the system, and how to make sure the consistency of the data, and how to double check if there are no conflicting data. That's my question.
So I think the question is very much about consistency and conflict in the data that's being presented in a centralized database.
Okay, there will be various ways to improve the what you call consistency or the accuracy or the the data, even from the data generated from people over the SNS and other things. One thing we are working at this point is that how can the our authority can identify the the Twitter tag and that kind of things, that who is there. So this is practically have been done in the last disaster time. So they already have a kind of a creating social, natural creation of the trust over the SNS, and then they kind of used the global journalism, used that trust as a kind of a first picking up a first source, and then the evaluate the contents of the data so that the accuracy of the data would be much better, and then regenerating from the kind of associative data. So that's one thing. And also, if we do have a kind of this is also the example, but we do have a kind of a pre-training and the drill of what kind of information is going to flow, like what we have experienced last year. And then, next time, then we do have various ways to improve the trust of the data, so that including the consistency of the data, and then that mechanism could be achieved.
I'll add to that, and I agree with everything. I think there's a few ways that you can verify data. One is the rating of the data provider. How long has their account been in existence, for example? Also the idea of outsourcing, pushing out to the cloud, to BPO providers, sometimes in the developing world. So it becomes an economic development thing for other parts of the country to take on the task of verifying that information. And World Vision in November is going to be going through a simulation in Bangladesh on a system that will do exactly that with real-life incoming SMS and pushing it out for verification or verifying on the spot automatically by the duration the account's been open, by the trust of the user, and a few other rubrics.
I think, that we also have to remember too is that the technology is a part of the whole process, and that realistically we can gather a whole heap of data, we can verify it to our best sort of ability, but we also have to get out in the actual field and check that out as well. Yeah. You know what I mean? So we're not, the data and the technology is not going to deliver the aid, so we're still going to be out there. So looking at that data, going, okay, we think this is the trends or these are the important parts of what we need to do, get the boots on and get out in the field and make sure that's correct as well, deliver the aid.
And as the beneficiaries have access to those technology platforms, they will actually provide input or information directly, and they will become most accurate and real-time information.
Yeah.
Applauding your imagery during Haiti, a lot of the verification we got from those types of messages came from imagery.
Wonderful. We have one question in the front.
Thank you. I'm Bill Berger from USAID, and I ran the US government's DART for the response in Japan. And one of the things that concerns me about all of this real-time data is unless there is a coordination mechanism backing it up, it's difficult. We talk about verifying the information, but oftentimes the information it may just be data. It may not be information. It has to be turned into information. I mean, in Japan, and this happens all over the world, we get information from an area, particularly on things like medical issues, that there's a disease outbreak or something, and only come to find out that that was speculation or it was somebody reporting that was not actually authoritative. And what happens is that pulls the response off track, particularly if we're not coordinating the response. If you just have people monitoring the internet and they hear that something's happening here, then everybody goes there. Mm-hmm. I mean, this happened during the Orissa supercyclone in India. I call it the Ursima block response, where Ursima block was named the most affected district. And so all the assistance went there, and very little assistance went to the blocks right around, even though they were also affected, but they were not named most affected. So we still have to have a coordination mechanism behind this, and of course all of it points to preparing before a disaster happens and understanding how the coordination should work in these kinds of interests. And as the information comes in, having some kind of wiki process that helps us understand what is information out of this huge mass of data. But this kind of real-time information without coordination, can work at cross purposes with an effective and equitable response to a disaster.
A thought on that. That's a fabulous comment. I really appreciate that. Converting data into business intelligence is really a key challenge at hand once you've verified that the data indeed is correct. And so the people that I'm working within World Vision who are taking that role on sort of gave me marching orders in coming here, a request. And that's that, can we federate out certain areas of expertise? Maybe it's to universities, to students, to others, so that should certain types of data need to be analyzed and business intelligence coming out of that, whether it's for response, whether it's for early warning, developing patterns for drought, for global warming, for whatever it might be. But there's multiple areas of expertise that we might want to look at a federated system to distill out of data. So if anybody's interested in that, come see me.
Of course, the United Nations Office for Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, is very much looking into the coordination issue. And one of the key things that we are looking at is how we can ensure that there is a coherent, prepared data sets. So what we call common operational data sets, which we are collecting using qualitative information that we gather from different sources. So having that as prepared kind of data sets, but also right after crisis, we need to ensure that we collect right information, the needs, but then the information, as you rightly pointed out, has to be analyzed and disseminated in the right way. And we are in the process of actually making all this information coming from different UN agencies and different NGO partners into one consolidated and information hub, so that actually we can make the information useful for all. So we are in the process of developing this system at the moment, and we hope to be able to launch it sometime next year. It's a real-time information, but it's not just any kind of information, it's a prioritized information in such a way that it will help the team on the ground to be able to make timely and effective decision-making.